So good morning, everyone. All of you online joining, thank you. And everyone here in the Gompa, it's nice to have a good crowd here today. So, all right. So Nancy, will you be leading the prayers today then? Yes. Excuse me. So Shayla, thanks for getting those on screen, and we'll start with prayers. And keep in mind, in Buddhism, prayers are really about aligning our minds in a particular direction. And with this opening prayer, we're generating the two thoughts: refuge, which is a sense of finding some safe direction in regard to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And then, secondly, the thought of bodhicitta, which again, we're going to be talking about today in the class, as well as meditating on a little bit shortly. So we'll get the prayers up, and there we go. Okay, so Nancy, thanks for leading these.
Taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. Once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By merits I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodam soki choknam la changju bardu dagmi kyapsuchi dagi chinyun gigpe sonam gi drola penchir sangye druparsho. Sangye chodam soki choknam la changju bardu dagmi kyapsuchi dagi chunyen gepe sonam gi drola penchir sangye druparsho.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. So again, today we're going to do a little bit longer meditation. And again, I know it's somewhat hard sometimes to come in and go right into a longer meditation, but last week we talked about immeasurable compassion. So I wanted to do a meditation on that to start with. And of course, that feeds quite naturally into our motivation of bodhicitta. So in the meditation, we're going to start as usual with just a few minutes of watching the breath. So if you need a suggestion in regard to doing that, you can tune into the sensation towards the tip of the nose where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale, as you exhale. And just try to keep the mind present there. And whenever the mind wanders, just gently guide it back to the breath. If you have another breathing technique that you prefer to use, you're welcome to do that. So we're going to do this in silence for a few minutes just to focus our minds a bit. And then I'll come in and I'll lead you on this meditation, on generating compassion, first for ourselves and then for all beings, and some thoughts that accompany that. And then we'll again kind of move that into our motivation of bodhicitta for our time together today. So let's begin the meditation now then with focusing on the breath. So now to generate compassion, we're going to start with ourselves. We have to generate this wish for ourselves to be free from our suffering before we can extend that thought to others. So we do have to get in touch with our own dissatisfaction, suffering, discontentment. We'll examine the three ways that we can analyze our own situation, and then we'll be extending that to others. But first of all, to see the more obvious ways that we suffer. Every one of us having to deal with illness, aging, death, having to be parted from the things that we find pleasurable, enjoyable, having to face the things that we find unpleasant. These are more obvious forms of suffering, but it's important to start there to see that these lives we have do have those moments when we have to experience pain or anguish. The Buddha taught that we can also see the suffering nature of even our pleasant experiences. And we call this the suffering of change. This is the fact that anything that we do enjoy in these conditioned lives that we're living isn't capable of sustaining that happiness. It's not a final solution, and it will change, even to pain, if we extend the time that we spend with it. Think about all the pleasurable experiences you've had in this life. Not a single one of them has really done the trick. They've lasted for a while, and then they've dissipated, and then we've had to go back to them to recreate those pleasant sensations. We are not capable of finding any real lasting peace or happiness from all of these experiences. That is their very nature, conditioned in that way. And of course, both of these experiences, the more painful ones, the pleasant ones, are arising within the sphere of what we call our conditioned existence. And we have a suffering tone that pervades that completely because we're under the control of two things, our karma and our delusions. This is the subtlest form of suffering or dukkha that the Buddha taught. This is the very condition we find ourselves in right now, and we've never had a moment's rest from this. Every one of us under the control of these factors. Again, think about this in regard to yourself. Reflect briefly on these three types of suffering or dukkha, and begin to generate thoughts of compassion towards yourself. You have to see that we ourselves are worthy of compassion. We deserve to be free from our suffering, all of what causes our suffering. And start to generate these thoughts towards yourself. May I be free of suffering and all its causes. May I find true peace. May I not have to experience pain, difficulty. And whatever thoughts work for you, just generate with your heart wide open, loving, kind thoughts towards yourself, wishing for yourself to be free from all suffering. And just continue to generate this compassionate wish towards yourself. May I be free from harm. May I be free from all danger, all difficulty, and so on. And we can begin to extend this thought to others, kind of feeling ourselves filled with compassionate wishes towards ourselves. We want to generate those same thoughts towards all beings. We can begin by visualizing beings surrounding us. To either side and in the space behind us, we can feel our friends, the close ones in this life, those who we already have some compassion and affection towards. Kind of feel them there supporting you in this space again, immediately behind you and to either side. And in the space in front of you, kind of confronting you, are all of the difficult people, the enemies, those who are challenging for you in this life, at least at this time in this life. Those who have done things to harm you or those that you love, or who are holding views or committing actions that you disagree with. And try to be as specific as possible, visualizing these beings in front of you, the difficult ones. And then surrounding those two groups that you have a more defined relationship with are all those beings that you don't have a relationship with, the strangers, the neutral ones, going out in all directions, surrounding these two groups, are all of those individuals that we haven't yet made a direct connection with. And kind of behind the scenes, this is a huge number of beings that are just simply not within our awareness usually. So first recall that whatever group any individual is in, they are the same as every other individual. All sentient beings simply wanting to be free of suffering and yet continuing to suffer, continuing to have that more obvious form of suffering, the pain, the anguish, continuing to have the suffering of change, continuing to have that pervasive condition to suffering under the control of their karma, their delusions. This is the exact same situation we ourselves are in. We want to become aware of their suffering, really hold that thought that they are suffering in a variety of ways, some of which may not be as obvious to us. Then we begin to generate the same thoughts of compassion that we had towards ourselves, towards these beings, and we can do it in progression, starting with the friends, the close ones. It should be quite easy for us to look at them through the lens of compassion, to generate the same thoughts. May you be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. May you be free from harm and pain, danger, difficulty. And use whatever thoughts come to mind for you in relation to first that group of friends, people who are very close to us. We already do care about their well-being. Just strengthen those compassionate thoughts. May you be free from suffering. And feeling your heart filled with compassion for those beings, extend that out to the strangers. And we can recall the ways that these strangers are also kind to us. It's often very indirect, unintentional. They are involved in our welfare. We are in a world of interdependence. So many of those beings who are strangers do things that we benefit from, producing the food that we eat, the vehicles we drive, the houses we live in, the energy that we use. All of this is due to the kindness of these beings that we don't know. And these beings are suffering as well, in the same ways that we are, that our friends are. So begin to generate thoughts of compassion towards them. And just feel your heart open to these beings. May you be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. And using whatever language works for you. Feel your heart extend to those beings. And feeling our heart full of compassion for our friends, all these strangers, ourselves. We now take on the more difficult task of generating compassion for those who have harmed us or who we find difficult in this life. And how have they been kind to us? In conventional terms, they've been the opposite. They've been unkind. But we can choose to see it as a kindness. We can actually benefit from the presence of those difficult people, beings in our lives by generating deeper patience, compassion, concern, love in response to their harm. They are the true test for whether our compassion is complete. And as is often said, these difficult people are our perfect gurus, our best gurus, the teachers of patience, of compassion, tolerance. So begin to generate thoughts of compassion towards them. Because in fact, if they were free from suffering and all the causes of suffering, they wouldn't be harming others. So generate those thoughts as best as you can towards the difficult people, the enemies. May you be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. May your mind be at peace. May you be free from harm, and so on. So in this way, there's no being that we have not made the object of our compassion. As best as we can, we've generated these thoughts. This is a very powerful thought of wishing for all beings to be free from suffering and all of what leads to suffering. We have to advance this thought a bit more and think, Can I take responsibility for doing that? Try to feel this superior intention, this thought that I will do this for these beings. Even if it is by myself alone, I will care for every one of them and lead them out of suffering into the state of peace, into enlightenment. But of course, how do I do that? In my current state, I'm simply not qualified. I must become a Buddha. I must become enlightened, for in that state I can then work spontaneously and perfectly, effortlessly for the welfare of all beings and lead them on their path to attaining their ultimate welfare. And this is the thought of bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha, so we then can help all sentient beings to be free from suffering and achieve their greatest potential. Just hold this thought very deeply in your heart. So everything we do today becomes a cause for that result. You can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So thank you for doing a meditation with me. I just find that with this topic in particular, sometimes when I teach, I don't necessarily lead a meditation, but I feel like with these four immeasurables, it's really important that we practice these together, and there is some support that we have in doing this in community. So thank you for doing that. For the last one, we'll just do a mini meditation at the end, kind of rejoicing. So I did want to talk just a little bit more about compassion. I touched on the near enemies. Remember, these are the things that are close to compassion, where we might think we're being compassionate, but we're missing the mark just a little bit. Does everyone remember what those two were? Anyone want to? One of them has this feeling of superiority, pity. Okay. Again, maybe it's not a technical definition of pity, that it's coming from a place of superiority. We often use that word quite loosely. Even in some Tibetan texts, I see it presented as kind of what compassion is about. But again, pity has the feeling of kind of looking down on somebody, feeling you're kind of pitying their situation, but you don't see that you're in the same situation, essentially. You don't have that kind of empathy that is identifying with others in that very deep way, and seeing that there, but for the grace of our karma, go I. You know, if it wasn't for the good conditions that I had, I wouldn't be, I would be in that same situation. We can have that empathy for another, again, because that's really the root of compassion, is empathy. The ability to feel the pain of another, to be with another's situation. So we need to kind of, if we have pity, we need to go back to the equanimity meditation and particularly look at ourselves and see how we are exactly the same as everyone else. There's nothing, again, but karmic conditions that have led for me to be the person who has a roof over my head and someone else to be unhoused on the street, right? That's all that it comes down to, essentially. I've been unhoused in many lifetimes. I've been on that end of things countless lifetimes. Just in this lifetime, I've got some good fortune and what have you. So then I can, again, see others in a more equal light rather than pitying them. The second one, again, was what I think Pema Chodron translated as Kamala Shila's term as horrified anxiety. It's that feeling of overwhelm when we open to the suffering of others. And that can be, again, an obstacle for us in many different ways, because if we aren't able to kind of be with the suffering of another, it never moves out of that. It becomes more about us and our pain at feeling the suffering that others are going through, right? It's hard. I mean, look at just how difficult it is when you have a friend in hospital or something and you have to go into the hospital and sit with them and be in that uncomfortable space of them dealing with their crisis, their pain, whatever is happening for them. And it's very hard for us to be with the pain of other people, other beings. But we have to be able to do that. Again, the answer there, if we are having a problem with that kind of overwhelm, is to go back to the reality that every one of us is capable of being free from that suffering. Those are, again, conditioned experiences. The reason why we're suffering is because we have the causes of suffering. We can get rid of the causes of suffering. Remind yourself of the fact that we all have Buddha nature. We all have a mind that is fundamentally pure. and all the garbage that's causing our suffering can be removed. That's what the whole path to enlightenment is all about. Can we remove it gradually, just in a more temporal way, and then eventually in a more permanent way, to where we never have to experience suffering again? So again, those are the two things that can become obstacles where we think we got this compassionate feeling going on, but we're kind of missing the mark. I didn't talk about the far enemy of compassion, which is its exact opposite. But I think we all know that, right? It's the cruelty, the harmfulness that can come, right? Where we are capable. And again, I talked about Vinnie Ferraro a few sessions ago. I won't mention his story again. He was beating up homeless people with baseball bats before he had this kind of St. Paul moment and became very compassionate, kind, whatever, got in touch with his little soft spot, this more heart qualities and what have you. Every one of us has that potential. But we can have instances in our lives, and maybe even in countless other lifetimes, where we become cruel, where we become insensitive to the suffering of others. And we are capable of even inflicting harm on others without any real conscience, right? And we see it in our world, right? And whenever we see things in our world, remember that's just a reflection of what we have ourselves. Every one of us has the seed of cruelty in our own mental continuum. Perhaps we've done really well at not nurturing that. We've become much kinder, more compassionate, concerned, and caring. But know that that is always there, that potential to fall into that kind of cruel mode, where we might inflict harm on another being out of some sense of malice, ill will, what have you. So I just wanted to touch on that really briefly, and I'll do the same in regard to immeasurable joy, the fourth of the immeasurables. This one is kind of an interesting one as we move into it. Let me see if there are any questions or comments on compassion before I move on. Not that I'm completely done with compassion, but none of us is. But we'll get to that maybe a little bit more shortly when we talk about bodhicitta. Any comments, questions? Okay, so again, the fourth immeasurable, we started with immeasurable equanimity, which kind of levels the playing field. The second one is immeasurable love, where we open our heart with focusing on the happiness for beings and their lack of happiness. Immeasurable compassion is where we focus on their suffering and our wish for them to be free of that suffering. So the fourth one, immeasurable joy, is kind of an interesting one because it's taking a look at the situation of beings and imagining them being in a state where they have greater happiness and well-being, freedom from suffering, and taking delight and joy in them being in that situation. And of course, we have temporal situations, we have the more ultimate situation. But let me go ahead and share on the screen. Oh, we didn't recite our Four Immeasurables prayer, but let's let that go for now because I actually have a lot to cover today. You all have the Four Immeasurables prayer. Again, this is, whoops, I didn't get it on the screen. There we go. Is it on the screen now? Something's on the screen. Okay, there it is, Four Immeasurable Thoughts. Again, we won't recite this today, but we are down here at the fourth one after immeasurable equanimity, love, and compassion with immeasurable joy. And as you see, even in this verse, it's saying how wonderful it would be if all sentient beings were never separated from the happiness of higher rebirth, having a good existence within the round of samsara, and liberation. Of course, liberation is where you have attained freedom from all of that nonsense, where you've removed all of the causes of suffering and no longer are experiencing that. So we're kind of thinking about beings in these more elevated states within conditioned existence, but even beyond that, even transcending that. And we're wishing for sentient beings to have that experience and then kind of taking delight with them. It's not really worded in that prayer quite as clearly as it is in some of the other thoughts, right? Where we have this idea, joy isn't even mentioned in there. You don't even have it other than in the title of this. But the idea is that we're trying to cultivate this sort of, they use the word sympathetic joy often, kind of feeling the joy of another. We can start with, of course, experiencing our own joy. And that's what we're going to do. I hope that's on the screen now, the little handout on immeasurable joy, where I put together first a quote and then a little bit of instruction for how we meditate on this. But let's talk about the quote first. This is again from Kathleen MacDonald's wonderful book on the Four Immeasurables. She says, taking delight in the happiness, success, and good fortune of others is one of the ways that we practice, and she called it the third immeasurable thought, because remember, I'm taking the fourth one and moving it to the front, so it's now our fourth one, but I kept her wording there and put a little footnote on there. This is the immeasurable thought of joy. Immeasurable joy is often called sympathetic joy because it's not a private joy, such as we might feel from winning a tennis game. Rather, it is a joy that is outer directed and inclusive of others. Immeasurable joy is like a further extension of immeasurable loving kindness because it wishes everyone to experience happiness, not only now, but far into the future. So there is this kind of connection with immeasurable love, but also even with immeasurable compassion, because we're taking delight in kind of both of those coming to fruition. The ability for all sentient beings to attain a more lasting state of peace and happiness, again, within an existence, but also in a beyond existence. And then, of course, for them to be free from suffering and all the causes of that. So this is a practice that we often simply call rejoicing. Essentially, what we are doing is we're trying to generate this additional sort of joy by looking at the situation that beings are in and taking delight in that. And kind of as a question, I've been trying to open these discussions on these with some sort of a question for us to entertain and see what people's thoughts are. So why do we find it difficult to do this? Maybe some of you find it easy to do this, but it's not something we are naturally inclined to do, to suddenly, when we see somebody having some good fortune, to suddenly go, oh, wow, I take delight that you're having that wonderful experience. What are some of the obstacles, perhaps, to us having this ability for that joy to arise naturally? Does anyone have any thoughts on that they'd like to share? Yes, please. Good, Carrie. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm pointing to the microphone here, Carrie. Yes, thank you. Just want to get you on microphone. And then I'll go to the online as well. I think there's one or two comments there, but please, Carrie.
The comparison trap.
Okay. You want to talk a little more about that?
Just when we get into just making it about ourselves and comparing, like, oh, well, I don't have that. I wish I had that, but just getting into that trap.
Right, right. Because that comparison is leading, of course, to what Karen, I think, put in the box on the chat box here. Comparing is coming up there as well. Jealousy, right? Jealousy is a natural outcrop of our comparison mentality, right? We think someone else has more than we have. Again, there's this confusion between jealousy and envy. I'm going to use them interchangeably. Sometimes if you look them up on the dictionary, they're a little bit different thoughts. But we're essentially talking about when other people have something good, we're often wanting that for ourselves or wish that we had that good fortune, right? So we can't take delight in what they have because we're blocked by our own jealous thoughts. It just, why are they getting that? Well, when did they create the causes for that? Or, why is that happening for them, right? Any other thoughts about anything else that might get in the way of our not having that openness to rejoicing in others? That's the big one, jealousy.
Anyone online that has a thought?
Yeah. Oh, yes, please. Lauren wants to share something. You can just hand the microphone back, maybe. Yeah. Thanks.
An obstacle could be if you take issue with the cause that has led them to celebrate.
Okay. Do you want to give an example of that, Lauren? If you can. Right.
Well, sure. A dramatic example would be seeing people celebrate and be genuinely joyful about who they have just slaughtered.
Right, right. That Schadenfreude kind of thing, joy in someone else's suffering or, yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Lauren. That's another one too that certainly gets in the way, is that if we see there's something kind of wrong with that I remember they had that video that came out after 9/11 where they had Osama bin Laden and his cohorts in a little room and they were videotaping them rejoicing at what happened with the Twin Towers and all of this, and so again, when they're happy and taking delight in something that brings them pleasure, but it's not a good thing to take pleasure in, right? That's a kind of misplaced thing. So certainly at those times, I mean, one of the things when we talked about this in regard to immeasurable love, when we're wishing for the happiness of another, we're not wishing for them to have this kind of mistaken happiness, this happiness that arises from someone else's misfortune. we're really wanting people to have more genuine, pure forms of happiness that arise from their own good efforts, their own virtuous minds, and so on, and then the experience of those to the greatest degree. Same goes with rejoicing. I mean, I don't want you rejoicing in people's misfortune. That's not what we're trying to generate at all, but that is where it can become kind of out of whack. Yes, Coral, please. Oh, I'm sorry, Lorraine. I didn't realize you had the microphone or were ready to talk. I'm sorry, Lorraine.
Thank you. I was thinking a lot of the time, it's hard to rejoice when you're overwhelmed by the amount of suffering.
Yeah.
That we see so much suffering right now, and they see one person celebrating, and it's kind of like, yeah, good for you.
Right.
And we take care of everything else.
That's a very good point, Lorraine. Yeah, because I think again we can see that the heaviness of what's going on sometimes doesn't allow the space for us to rejoice because that's a lot of suffering going on. Coral, yes, please.
And it's that very human condition of I.
Yes.
I think you should do this. I think you should think the way I think. If only you thought the way I thought, you'd be fine.
Right.
Why, if everyone did what I said, the whole world would be wonderful.
Right.
And here we are coming from our deluded self saying that, and yet the stories that can come up in our heads about are so overwhelming, and we can just justify our own misfortune and our own suffering. And then we just kind of bleed that out over everyone around us, right?
Yeah, this is very true. Because that is what's driving the whole show, right? That constant focusing, centering on me, I, and thinking that what I have or my thoughts or my way of being is the perfect way. And so we sometimes get blocked to even opening up to other people's experiences of joy or well-being because that's not what we want. That's not what fits this ego, this I. Yeah. These are problems. Anyone else, anything that comes to mind around this? I think oftentimes too, and I think we have to be careful, in Buddhism, we get a very elevated sense of what we want for beings, right? And so we think, well, a lot of times people are getting attached to the things that bring them joy or that are sources of happiness for them, right? And we might think, oh, we're looking at others and they're having that experience, but we might look down on them. It's almost, again, a little bit of what pity is doing, but here in regard to not taking so much delight in what they have because we see it as a source of attachment for them, or we see it as something that maybe causes them more confusion. I remember when Venerable Urbina was here once, and she was really encouraging the center to open like a gift shop of some sort. And she was just saying, well, just fill it up with delightful things that sentient beings are going to want to buy. Don't worry about the attachment that comes with that. But sometimes in Buddhism, we get really focused on that, like not wanting to induce the attachment of other beings or something. And so if we take delight in what they have that we see that they're maybe clinging to, that they're having some of that distorted relationship with, might be hard to find space in our heart to have joy because we want to separate out the attachment and say, yeah, it's not good for them to have the attachment, but to have the pleasant experience, nothing wrong with that. And that's the one thing we have to remind ourselves constantly is that having these sources of happiness in our lives that may be quite temporal, getting a good meal, having a delightful experience on vacation or whatever that you might do, those are not in themselves problematic. It's the relationship that we have towards those things. The clinging, the grasping, the wanting them to not end, the wanting to keep going back to them and constantly being obsessed with them, and all of that is the mind of desire and attachment that becomes problematic. Lama Yeshe, apparently, this is what Venerable Urbina often says, he used to say, the more pleasure, the better, dear. The more pleasure you have, it's not a problem. The problem is how we relate to that. So I just wanted to point that out as well, because sometimes we might look at people and we see them all enjoying something and really having a good time, and we recognize that there's a lot of attachment going on there, but you still can take delight in the pleasure that they're experiencing. Once more, we have to go back to the understanding of karma, that the only reason why any being is experiencing anything that brings them happiness is because they've created the causes for that, which are virtuous. Happiness cannot arise from non-virtue. So again, if they are having that happiness experience, if they have billions of dollars and are the richest person in the world, I don't know who I'm thinking of, but anyway, if they have that good fortune, they created it through virtue. Now, again, maybe in this life they didn't. Maybe in this life there are problems with how they acquired the resources or those pleasurable experiences. But those were only the causes and conditions that led for that karma to ripen. What planted the seed for that karma had to have been virtuous actions they engaged in the past, probably lifetimes ago. And so now all that karma is coming into fruition based on causes and conditions that have come together in this life. And they're having this amazing good fortune. And oftentimes, again, we might have these blocks to looking at them and taking delight in their good fortune because we don't like something about the being or about the way that they're going about using those resources. That's a whole different karma. How they choose to use their good fortune in this life is going to create the patterns that will ripen into their own future experience. There's where we might even have compassion towards them, right? Because, yeah. Oh, there are a couple of comments. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for
Karen
keeping an eye on it.
Bender mentioned, as far as what you were asking, that we feel that others don't deserve their good fortune.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Susan Bauer says, although all that money and good fortune doesn't necessarily equal happiness, that is perhaps our perception.
Yeah, I think that's true too. What Karen shared, certainly, that we feel they don't deserve it. Like we look at them in this life and think, well, we don't like the person, we don't like what they're doing, and then we think, yeah, they don't really deserve that. But karmically, they do. Karmically, they had to have created the causes for it. And then again, the second point that Susan brought up, that is our projection. I mean, many people who have a lot of resources in this life, who are very rich, don't necessarily gain happiness from those resources, right? They might not have that experience. Yeah. Yes, Carrie. If you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone. Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you. This is so helpful. Just the conversation about, say, the billionaires or whatever it is that's going on, and they're in this lifetime, but then looking at how they are in this lifetime with those resources, right? The difference. And I
Yeah.
guess what I'm kind of mind blown right now I guess I always just kind of thought like with the rebirth, future lifetimes, that it kind of progresses. And
Yeah.
now I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. So that's it's what you do in this life. And
Yeah.
yeah, anyway, just wanted
No,
to share.
I know this thought, Carrie, because we do have this tendency of thinking also that, I mean, even if it doesn't progress per se, that if you, for example, okay, let's take this richest person in the world, some lifetimes ago, they created the karma for that. How do you create the karma for having resources in your life? Generosity, right? So you would think that they'd have this strong pattern of practicing generosity that will then have ripened into their good fortune in this life, that they would also carry with it the pattern of practicing generosity, right? Because the strength of that practice is what produced the resources. So you would think that it would be there. But again, nothing is that linear when it comes to karma. I'm not saying that all the work we do in this life is wasted by any means. If you practice these four immeasurables and they spill out into your life by you being kinder, more generous, and more concerned about the beings around you, you will carry forward that. But we never know what other factors might be in our karmic history, if you will, that might block that might arise where other conditions are inducing that. I mean, we could say, for example, if that richest person also, it grows up in a family where, yes, they are maybe encouraged to think in ways that kind of require those thoughts in this life that are more about watching out for yourself, getting everything, keeping it within your own little domain and not letting it go and not being so generous and kind. Those thoughts may influence you more than any karmic imprints you might have. Everything does require some kind of continual ripening for it to come into fruition. This is the nature of karma. It's not linear, it's very dynamic. We have a tendency in the West when people talk about karma, again, of seeing, okay, this happened here, he or she did this particular thing, and then over here, the same thing happens to them. That's a very, very weak example of karma and is not how karma plays out. Generally, karma, once more, has that ability to grow and develop. A simple act of generosity way back here in some other lifetime can ripen into unbelievable resources in a future life because karma increases in its potential. Karma isn't this static thing that is this action here that represents something that's exactly the same over here. It's got a whole process in between. So we do have to think about kind of it being very dynamic. So when we're observing other beings, let's get back to rejoicing in this whole thing. When we're observing other beings and they have this amazing good fortune in this life, the only way they could have created that is through creating virtue in the past that has ripened now in this lifetime. Now, whatever other patterns they're showing in this life that are, causing them to lie or to cheat or to steal or whatever it is that they are involved in, those are other karmas that they've created that have ripened based on conditions in this life. They've got all these amazing resources, but they're using them in unwise ways, or they're acquiring them in unwise ways. So karma is incredibly complex. Don't simplify it too much. And there are these kind of guiding principles about how it works, but the actual kind of playing out of that karma is very, very complex. So let's go to this idea then again of rejoicing. And thanks for this discussion. I think it was good because this is where we have to see, well, what is stopping me from opening my heart to being joyful upon seeing the good fortune of other beings? If I have a karmic understanding, that helps. So then I can really say, well, yeah, they must have created the causes for that. So I can take some delight in that. But again, will I take delight in the actions that they're doing? To go back to, we see them doing unhealthy things that are only going to lead to more suffering for them or for others. Then we can simply, not take delight in all that, but we can still take delight in the fact that they have these resources. And again, to Susan's point, maybe they aren't a cause of real happiness for them, but nonetheless, they are good fortune. That richest person in the world isn't homeless on the street in this life, right? They are the opposite of that. So we can at least have some kind of delight in that. So I don't want to talk too much about this fourth immeasurable, and yet I don't want to shortchange it either. But I think what's most helpful is for us to maybe look at how do we overcome these patterns by practicing it again, and particularly the jealousy. They often say that this practice of rejoicing is the exact antidote to our jealousy. So as with all of these that I've gone through, we really do start with ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with starting with ourselves. In fact, there's really positive benefits from rejoicing in your own good situation that you have, your own good actions that you engage in, and so on, because that does help us in inspiring us to do the same, right? If we rejoice in what we're doing, then we're going to tend to do it more. 9 out of 10, psychologists say. Um, so first, consider how you are the same as all beings and deserving to be happy, both temporally and ultimately, as well as having the potential to know those states of well-being. Again, so this is kind of our birthright. And due to the fact that we all have Buddha nature, every one of us can experience this ultimate well-being. So start with yourself. This is your birthright. This is what you deserve, is to be able to experience these joyous states and what have you. Then you generate an attitude of joy in your own goodness through the following steps. Recall all your good actions, qualities, those that have been beneficial to others, to you or to both. The ways that you've been cherishing others, holding them dear, practicing concern for them. The way that you've even taken care of yourself in healthy ways, the meditation practice you do every day, or whatever it is, the study you do, the coming to classes. Rejoice that you're here right now. With each of these positive qualities or virtuous actions, the second point here that you're recalling, think that it's good that you did these things, that you're glad you did them, and that you would gladly do them again. This is kind of that I was mentioning, kind of reinforcing our desire to continue to be this way. I think one of the hardest elements in the path, how inertia is this thing that kind of keeps you going if you're going, but also keeps you stopped. There is a tendency for things to kind of slow down. You kind of have this ability in our spiritual practice often to kind of revert to that stagnancy kind of thing, to fall back into those patterns. We need to kind of keep the moving thing going. And rejoicing is one of the ways that we do that. That's why I encourage everybody, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, do a purification practice at the end of the day. That's not the topic of this class, but that's how we clean up our karma that has been unskillful throughout our day, throughout our life. I always encourage people to do rejoicing as well then. Rejoice at the things you did each day. Take a look at it and say, oh, that was really nice that I fed the birds today, or it was nice that I gave somebody some money on the street, or it was nice that I, really kind of generate that joy in these things that you did. And it makes you happy to do them again. You get up the next day and you think, oh, how can I be virtuous, kind, concerned about others every single day of my life? So this is important. This is an important step of this, is to kind of think that you're really glad that you did these things. Rejoice in as many actions and qualities as you can remember, generating a more and more expansive feeling of joy in your heart. We're really simply talking about generating joy, thinking about these things. And normally we think about joy, perhaps thinking about our objects of attachment. Here we're trying to think about our virtue and the results of that virtue, trying to really keep that kind of joyous quality going in our heart. The fourth point there, reflect also on all the good things that you have in your life, whatever brings you joy and contentment, all of which have arisen through the force of your generosity, compassion, and other qualities. And take delight in them as well. Not, again, attachment, not desire for them, but kind of acknowledging, just like we did in talking about that richest person in the world, to take some delight in what they have, the possessions that they have that are only a product of their virtuous karma. It's the only way they could have gotten those things. Doing that with ourselves, all right? The final step in regard to that contemplation on ourselves, then generate the wish for you to experience all happiness, both temporal and ultimate, kind of generating that joy at the potential that you have to experience even more profound, lasting peace and joy. And then, as we've done with all of these are about these sayings that we are using to articulate this towards ourselves. Hold the wish that we've generated for our own happiness, temporally and ultimately, with thoughts such as, may I never be parted from the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation. May my own good fortune never diminish or depart. It really kind of, again, generating that joyful thought of, wouldn't it be wonderful if I was on this trajectory? I mean, we're talking about this kind of trajectory or kind of progression of our lifetime after lifetime. Well, it can be that way if we feed all the virtuous thoughts and diminish the negative ones, the non-virtuous thoughts, right? There's nothing wrong with making that, of expressing it in words. May I continue to develop and increase my qualities and potentials, and how wonderful it would be if that were the case, and of generating a joyful thought towards yourself. Again, joy and happiness, I do sometimes get the question, what's the difference between joy and happiness? I mean, joy does have sometimes a slightly different quality, and here we're not talking about, I think Paul Ekman, who's worked with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he researches emotions, human emotions, and he identified like 22 different aspects of joy. One of them is the Schadenfreude, where you're taking delight in someone else's misfortune, which is a joy, but it's not the joy we're talking about at all, right? But he kind of went to, in the Book of Joy, His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, they came up with kind of 3 defining qualities of what we mean by joy. And one of them is this rejoicing idea, that we were taking delight in the good fortune of others and, of course, ourselves as well. Also, we have the joy that's finding a deeper sense of well-being that arises from our spiritual practice. That can even be there in regard to compassion. Remember last week when I talked about compassion and how hard it is to feel that. We don't really necessarily feel joy when we're thinking about the suffering of other beings or witnessing the suffering of other beings. But there is a joy that can arise from compassion when we feel like we're being truest to our inner self, our true being. We are in line with how we are supposed to be in the world, compassionate and caring, woke, actually paying attention to what's going on in our world and responding effectively towards what's happening. Right? So again, these are the deeper sense of joy that we're talking about here, this kind of way of being in the world. And that is what will eventually evolve from this rejoicing practice, is that we'll be a much more joyful participant in the world. And that will be, in a sense, even what we offer to the world is our joy. His Holiness and the Archbishop talk about that very much, like that is one of the most profound acts of generosity that we can give to others, is our spiritual well-being. To be a source of joy for others just by how we present ourselves in the world. Not the opposite, not causing them to get worried or fearful of us, but rather to really take delight, to try to extend that joy to others. So anyway, it starts with ourselves. So work with yourself in regard to rejoicing in the good qualities and good things that you have done. And then we move on to a similar process that we've talked about of working with these three groups. And once more, the idea is to understand that that's natural for these three groups to occur. Even the Buddha had friends, strangers, and enemies in regard to his particular lifetime 2,500 years ago. He had his cousin Devadatta, who was his sort of arch enemy. He had many people who were very close to him as his friends, and many other individuals in this world who didn't know the Buddha at all. Even people living in the locale where the Buddha was and traveling and what have you didn't know the Buddha. So for ourselves, we start with friends, move on to neutral people, and then finally work with enemies. This is, again, you might see different presentations for this progression. And I've even heard from some people that say that they find it really difficult to work with strangers. They might find it easier to work with difficult people or enemies. But again, we should work with whatever is comfortable for us. And for most of us, it's friends first, and then opening to experiencing joy towards strangers or neutral people, and then finally enemies. So recall that meditation on equanimity that we did earlier, a few sessions back, to generate an even mindedness towards individuals from all these categories. And then begin to generate joy with regard to the good qualities, actions, and fortune of those in each of those three groups. We can start generating that thought, how wonderful it would be if you had, this happiness of good rebirth, experiencing liberation, and taking delight in whatever it is that they have that is leading in that direction. Their good qualities, the good actions they do, the things that they have that they possess that are a result of their good actions in the past. And then again, another way of referring to this joy is empathetic joy, which I sometimes prefer than sympathetic joy, because you're feeling joy with the happiness of another. You can extend that to all beings by recalling first that all beings have the potential to know both temporal and ultimate happiness. You can recall the ways that they've been kind. Remember, we talked about that 2 sessions ago when we went through immeasurable love. And then cultivate immeasurable joy with regard to all these beings with the prayer. And that's, again, the prayer that we started with when I moved into this topic today. How wonderful it would be if beings were in that state of never being separated from good rebirth, liberation. May they never be separated from these, and then elevating it to that more altruistic thought. I myself will do that for them, cause them to never be separated from these. And then invoking our gurus, the Buddhas, to grant us blessings to do that. So the last topic I want to talk about in regard to this is the far enemy. Well, we talked about the far enemy, the near enemy of this immeasurable joy. Does anyone know what the near enemy is? Again, near enemies are kind of close to it. They're a similar type of feeling, but they're a bit off the mark. I don't know if it's one that I don't think we think of quite as much as being that close to it. It's what's called frivolous joy, where you're kind of like having delight, but not really with any great purpose, perhaps. I think the frivolity, the state of being, given to trifling or undue levity, is the way that Alan Wallace describes it. The idea is that we just become kind of giddy with joy, without really a gravity to what joy is about. Again, joy is a wonderful feeling. Don't get me wrong. This is part of why we're using joy in the Four Immeasurables, is to keep that energy going. We often even use the phrase joyous effort or joyous enthusiasm, right? Because that is one of the main factors that keeps us engaging in the path. That's what I was saying earlier. When we rejoice in our own good fortune, that and our own good actions, that feeds into us continuing to do that every day. Put more energy into our practice. But the idea here is that you've gone kind of off the mark because you become a little more frivolous in your joy. You're not really generating a joy that's really directed. I don't know how often we're guilty of doing that. But anyway, rejoicing is really quite directed at embracing what is good based on the principles of karma and the good actions that beings are engaging in, the good qualities that they possess, all of which will ripen into good fruitions for them, all the way to enlightenment. So again, I don't want to shortchange joy so much, but one of the things I do want to focus on as part of this course is how these fit into the overall Mahayana structure, especially in regard to bodhicitta, that mind that we meditated on earlier today. Let me check in and see if there are any questions or comments about rejoicing before we move on. Lou has one, and then we'll come to and Nina. And then if anyone online, again, put your little hand up if you want to share something online, and otherwise put it in the chat box. Yes, please.
Okay, I just wanted to make a comment. Sometimes when I need a battery boost of joy and something wonderful happens in my life, I rejoice in whoever being that was in my past, whatever he did or she did to make this happen. I rejoice in what they did.
Why not? I mean, again, that's kind of the same continuum that's here known as Lou, that same mental continuum. But in a sense, it is a different person per se, because it had different conditions and causes and a different life and was labeled in a different way. And all of that good stuff that being did, you are now reaping the harvest of. So and that also keeps you, I think that is one way to also think about our future, right? You can think about, I'm going to do all of this for that future being that is again, that there is a continuity of awareness that's going through all of that. We're not denying that. But it is still another person who's going to be receiving the fruitions of all the good things that we've done, just like we're doing that with regard to our past existences. Yes, Nina, please.
I just wanted to share that it's really a very good practice to look for opportunities to be joyful. You said, Gandan, that it's nice to be able to share joy with others, but it's difficult to do when we are not well ourselves and when we are depressed or miserable and life is hard. I think, Lou, when you wait for things, nice things to happen, wonderful to happen, things to happen to you, it only happens once in a blue moon. But when we expand a little bit and look for wonderful things that happen to other people, it's like all the time.
This is true.
And then we can be really joyful all the time, or at least more time than we are otherwise. So I think it's really worth to make that effort and to look for opportunities. And like there's good things happening to people, wonderful things that people are doing all the time. And I sometimes think about it, when I think about it, I think about my mom, because I come from Poland originally, and Polish people are extremely passionate about soccer. So when there's like a big tournament or something like this, the whole country is, watching. And then when the Polish team loses, the whole country is in like deep misery for days, except for my mom. My mom will be like, it's true the Polish team lost, but the other team, if you saw them like dancing on the field and stuff, how happy they were, I feel like they really deserved it better. I don't think the Polish people had that kind of joy in them, kind of. I'm super happy for the other team, and I'm like, Mom, you're right. So my mom is like the only person in the country who is like super happy, and I'm like, well, so everybody should think these ways. I mean, you will be happy all the time, regardless who loses and who wins, So,
no, that's a very
like that.
good point. It's a very good point. I think I've said that before. Where like if people were really taking like their own happiness seriously, then if you were at a gathering of a game, soccer, whatever, and you had one team won and it wasn't your team, you'd still be happy that the other team gets to experience the winning and their fans get to rejoice and what have you. But we don't do that, right? Instead, oftentimes there's violence that happens after these games. So there's a wonderful quote from Master Shantideva in his 7th chapter. No, this is the 5th chapter. I'm sorry, the 5th chapter. 5th chapter is on this guarding alertness and he talks about different, I think this is the 5th chapter. This might be the 7th chapter. For some reason, I think it's the one on joyous effort. But anyway, this is what he says. The goal of every act is happiness itself. Though even with great wealth, it's rarely found. So take pleasure in the excellence of others. Let them be a heartfelt joy to you. The idea, kind of the same thing, if we're having a hard time finding happiness ourselves, if things aren't ripening in a particular moment for us to have that good fortune, well, then we can always find a source of happiness by taking delight in the good fortune of others. I do like how a lot of the evening news shows, they put something at the end that's kind of to bring you up after all of the 25 minutes of depressing news that, of horrible things going on in our world. And at the end, they like show somebody who's helping people in their community and doing this and that. You can kind of walk away with a little more lightness in your heart. But I think that's, again, what we're talking about. The sources of this joy are around you all the time. Just open up, experiencing it. Yeah, Lorraine, please.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd speak a little bit on validation because one of my greatest barriers to having joy in my life is a lot of guilt. I have had a very checkered past. I might still be a little bit nuts. And when I look back on it, I'm just, I have an easier time having joy for other people than I do for myself. And I don't know, there's a lot that I'm still processing. But there's also this whole thing about validation, how I keep hearing these teachings on how you don't need the validation of others, but I do. In order to feel like I deserve to have joy, I feel like I need people to tell me that I'm not that garbage that I once was,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that we can't discount that, Lorraine, in particular in your situation, to make sure that we do seek that out and we have people surrounding us who reflect that back to us, make sure that we get that validation. And for ourselves to reflect on what I was saying earlier about Buddha nature, who we are in any particular iteration. In this iteration, you're Lorraine and having this particular circumstances and causes and conditions of this life and what have you. Every one of us going through our own little sort of play that we're in regard to this particular life. But what's at the core of it is this pure, loving, kind, essential nature that is really who you are, in a sense. I mean, not in a kind of definitive way, because once more, we're not saying there's an absolute I there at all. But at the core of your being is all that goodness, all of that purity. And just to really trust that. You have moments, I'm sure, where you've seen that for yourself. All of us have, where we've kind of been in a very calm, focused place, and we can see our inner purity, our inner kind of well-being in a very, very precise way. And then kind of gets clouded over because we have a lot of garbage that we carry forward with us that's who we tend to identify with, not to identify with that inner purity. So I think anything that helps you with that, and if it's other people validating you, that's perfectly fine. We all need that to some degree. That's why people who are completely alone often do face some mental ramifications, because they're not getting that positive strokes from other people. I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling that you need that. I think every one of us needs that to a large degree. But then also to go back and do the work on ourselves and trust that at the core of our being is this beautiful, unbelievable, kind, loving, compassionate being. And we can be that all the time. We just have to find the way to remove all the other stuff that's getting in the way. So, shall we move on to bodhicitta? Oh, we have one more question. I'm sorry. Yes, please. Who was it? Someone over here? Some confusion. Is there or isn't there? Mark? Okay, Mark's going to share a comment or a question. Yes.
One of my favorite sources of joy is humor. And so I sort of looked at it. And it seems like the core essence of humor is actually terrible suffering. It's almost as if we were inoculated against debilitating confusion and suffering by giving us the ability to laugh at ourselves and at others as well. And so that's sort of what sang Freud, is that the
Schadenfreude?
The laughing at other people's misfortune. But at the same time, I don't feel like I like it. I mean, I like laughing at myself.
No, and yeah, I think the Schadenfreude is a little different. Going back to the Book of Joy, that was one of the 8 pillars of joy. I teach on these sometimes. Humor, and His Holiness and Archbishop, if you ever saw videos of the two of them together. There is even a video about the meetings that led to that book, a wonderful book called something Joy. What is it? But I thought it was called something else. There's the Book of Joy, but then I think there's something Mission Joy. Mission Joy, I think, is what the film was called. It's really wonderful. Anyway, you get a chance to kind of see them interacting with each other, and they're very capable of laughing at themselves. Yeah. Remember, there's one teaching that His Holiness was trying to get to me, and he had somehow his wires crossed, or was giving that, and he realized that he was not saying the right thing, and he just like started laughing and laughing and laughing that he made this mistake. So we do have to laugh at ourselves. It's not quite the same as Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is where you're really taking delight in someone else's misery because you don't like that person or have some skewed perception of it. Then here it's more like we need to have that lightness. Humor does induce joy. It's not the final solution, but nonetheless, it's an important part of our path. We have to be able to laugh at ourselves and see our own little foibles and humanity. He even points out because another of the pillars of joy is humility, and both of these come from the same root word in Latin, humus, which means the earth, kind of getting back in touch with kind of the earth, being grounded and not being so flighty and ridiculous, but just understanding that commonness that we all have, our shared humanity that we can laugh at. So it's a good point. Humor's a good source. I don't know that we laugh enough in Buddhism sometimes, but I like teachers that make me laugh. I don't know how much I make you laugh. Sometimes my humor is a little off, but but the reality is that that's how we learn best too often, is by having a lightness to it and not getting so deadly serious about everything. Yes, what the Buddha is teaching about in the Four Noble Truths and the truth of dukkha, suffering, it's a serious situation, don't get me wrong. But why be glum, Why be in that place of like absolute seriousness? Yes, negative emotions can be hilarious. This is true. And if we're able to kind of laugh at ourselves and our own silly patterns that we just keep stepping in again and again and again, we'll get there eventually. But if you take yourself too seriously and start self-flagellating and everything, we'll forget it. This is ridiculous. Not literally. I'm not saying you should. I'm saying mentally self-flagellating. Why beat ourselves up? And I don't know. Let me talk a little bit. I won't have time to go through all this because we've only got 15 minutes left, but you have the little handout, and most of you have extensive teachings on bodhicitta. So I don't need to kind of go through it all again. If you're someone who has not encountered these teachings, by all means, look them up. There are many books that talk about bodhicitta, classes here that will focus on bodhicitta in the future. Bodhicitta, again, is what the Four Immeasurables are meant to funnel into. We often say that they moisten the mind for bodhicitta. Let me read this little quote that actually is from Yanagarbha originally, but the only place that this is Anne Klein did a teaching on the Four Immeasurables, and she cites a book by Longchenpa. Longchenpa, the published book was called As I Come to Die, I think, and there's a set of teachings on the Four Immeasurables there from Longchenpa. He quotes this great Buddhist master Yanagarbha, who says, "On the well-prepared ground of equanimity, the flowers of love are scattered. They are furthered to fruition by the shade of compassion and purified by the clear waters of joy." Kind of a nice way to think of all four of these working together. That this is how these four immeasurables come together to really produce something extremely beautiful in our own minds and in our own hearts. And so, as it says there in that next quote, this is from Alan Wallace and not from Kathleen MacDonald, because Alan Wallace, in his book, Genuine Happiness, works with this idea of how do the four immeasurables fit into bodhicitta. He says, following the development of those, and just before the cultivation of wisdom, comes the crown jewel of all of Mahayana Buddhism. In Sanskrit, it is called bodhicitta, which Alan Wallace translates as the spirit of awakening. Sometimes we call it the mind of awakening or the mind of enlightenment. Bodhicitta is simply the term we use frequently, meaning that. Bodhicitta is the heartfelt aspiration to achieve spiritual awakening for the sake of all beings, an aspiration fusing the two noblest goals. The first is to seek enlightenment, but pursuing this aspiration for oneself alone ignores something fundamental about the nature of our existence. None of us lives in isolation, independent of those around us. Our existence is one of interrelationship. Thus, our aspirations must include the welfare of others. This brings us to our second noble aspiration. What can I do to help? I want to point out that the way that Alan Wallace presents this is not the way that all teachers present it in terms of, yes, there are two aspirations, two noble goals: to become enlightened, to become a Buddha, and then to be able to achieve the welfare of others through attaining that goal. But it's interesting, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in his book, The Joy of Compassion, I don't know if we have copies of these out there, but it's we do? Okay. There's a nice little passage where he talks about this. Let me see if there it is. Where he really says that the second of these should be coming first. We don't want to see them kind of as just equals. We actually want to have the drive to benefit sentient beings first. He says, why do I put enlightenment second? He says, of course, enlightenment is extremely important because without it, you cannot work perfectly for sentient beings. You cannot be a perfect guide, knowing, seeing directly every sentient being's mind, seeing their level of karma, their intelligence, their wishes and characteristics, as well as the various methods that suit their individual dispositions. But what should be in your heart is sentient beings as the reason for your attaining enlightenment. The first priority in your heart should be the happiness of sentient beings in your heart. What should be the first thing in your heart, in your life, the goal of your life? Sentient beings. He goes on, there's a wonderful chapter that's called Getting the Best from Your Life. He's making a really important point here, is that when we kind of put enlightenment first, and we think, oh, may I, and we even say that in the prayer, right? May I become enlightened for the sake of all sentient beings, as if like the most important thing is me becoming enlightened so that I can then benefit all beings. Well, it does become even antithetical to what we're trying to cultivate, which is this genuine wish to cherish all beings first, to really think about their welfare and let that be the driving force for getting us to enlightenment. I often use the example with bodhicitta of, some of you have heard this before, and I need to probably come up with new examples, but that's just the way it is today. An example might be a young girl who has a lot of cancer in her family. Perhaps she lost a parent to cancer, maybe even other relatives. And so she becomes really moved by having to see what people have to go through dealing with cancer, as well as her own loss of people in her life with cancer. She decides as a very young girl, I'm going to do something about cancer in the world because people are really suffering from this, including people that I know and so on. So she makes a determination at a very young age to become an oncologist or become a cancer researcher, whatever the case might be. And she knows that at this very young age, she's not capable of benefiting people with cancer, right? She might be able to go to the hospital and visit people with cancer, but she can't help them deal with their illness. Instead, she has to become qualified to do that. But her driving force that causes her to go off to university and medical school and all of what she needs, her internship and everything, what makes her a person who can then benefit people with cancer. She's doing that because she cares about people with cancer and those that are affected by that, right? I think the example works because it really shows how we put that first. My first goal is to benefit people. And then I realize that I have to be able to become qualified to do that. My first goal is to help all sentient beings. So therefore, I have to become a Buddha to do that. So that's why Rinpoche says enlightenment is second, helping sentient beings is first. Because also, I think what this does, we do have a tendency, I think, in our culture, our Mahayana culture, to think, I can't benefit sentient beings until I become enlightened. So therefore, hey, you guys all take care of yourself until then, and I'm just going to do whatever I can to ripen my own mind. And then when I'm ready, I'll be able to help all of you. Well, if we are thinking of sentient beings first, then we do whatever is necessary. And in fact, in the Bodhisattva vows, those of you who've taken the vows and the secondary vows, there's a whole list of things that we should be doing, right? When there are sick people, we should be tending to them. When there are people who are traveling and they need a place to stay, we should be giving them comfort and safety and all of these things that we see. That I do feel like in Buddhism sometimes we miss the mark on that. We don't necessarily think that it's our job to respond to the suffering we see in the moment. Instead, we think, oh, that's evidence of my suffering. I can generate compassion and then take it to the cushion and help develop my own mind into a Buddha. Do that too, don't get me wrong. But if you can deal with the suffering of beings in the world right now, of course do it. Of course, tend to the suffering of beings in whatever way it's manifesting. So I like this idea that Rinpoche sets out in this book of really elevating sentient beings to being most important in bodhicitta. These two desires, may I be able to benefit all sentient beings by becoming enlightened myself. That's the idea behind it. So let me introduce you, some of you have seen this before, again, most of you perhaps, to what is all involved in cultivating bodhicitta. There are several techniques for doing this, two that can then be united. The sevenfold cause and effect technique. We again can see that the immeasurables fit into this. You begin this process with immeasurable equanimity in your own mind, developing this even-mindedness towards all beings, because you're going to want to think about their welfare regardless of what category they're falling into, regardless of these distorted ways that we might be relating to them. We have to get rid of our attachment, our aversion, our indifference, and so on, as we discussed when we went through the equanimity in the first class. Then, on the basis of that, you go through the sevenfold cause and effect technique. You see all sentient beings as having been your mother or someone very dear to you. But if we've had countless lifetimes, we've been in a relationship of being the offspring of every single sentient being. They have been our dear mother. And we remember their kindness. We don't remember it specifically because we don't remember our prior lives, but we can infer their kindness, that they cared for us. Look at how animals even care for their young, most of them, especially mammals, right? They're very involved in the care of their young, wishing to repay their kindness. And then, of course, you generate on the basis of that thought of repaying their kindness, the love that wants to place all beings in happiness, and then the great compassion, which is immeasurable compassion with the intention to free all beings from suffering. And then we generate an altruistic intention to do that, thinking, even if it is by myself alone, I will do that. We did that when we did the meditation today. And then that will result in this mind. Well, how do I do that? Just like this young girl thinking, well, how do I benefit all these people with cancer in our world? Well, I have to become an oncologist. I have to become a researcher, whatever the case might be. So it's the same here. We think, well, then I have to become a Buddha. There's no other way to benefit beings perfectly. Yes, you can do a lot in the moment. Don't get me wrong. But my gosh, look at the world we live in, with 8 billion human beings almost, and then all the other animals, other sentient beings that inhabit this world. That's just this world. The Buddha says there are countless other worlds and other realms of existence that we don't even have any interaction with. So again, the only way to become an effective force in the world to alleviate the suffering of beings and place them in happiness is by becoming a Buddha. But it's generated from that thought of the suffering of others that we see, their lack of happiness, and our sincere wish to rectify that situation. The other technique is the one that's extremely powerful as well, taught by Master Shantideva in particular in his text that I've been quoting here and there. Again, you can start with immeasurable equanimity, and then you go through this process of equalizing and exchanging self and others. The equalizing is where you see that equal status that we all have. Again, any one of you, your wish for happiness and your desire to be free from suffering is no different than mine. Mine isn't superior in any way. I just hold it to be superior due to my own self-centeredness, my own self-cherishing. So I have to see the faults of continuing to do that. If I continue to focus only on my own welfare, my own state of being, and neglect everyone else, I'm only going to create more problems and difficulties. I have to see that there are great benefits if I actually focus on the welfare of others. So that's the next step, contemplating the advantages of exchanging self and others, taking where I normally hold myself to be more important and relegating myself to an inferior position and hold others to be most important. And then you determine the ability to do that, saying, I will do this. This is the pathway that all the Buddhas have taken. I will exchange self-concern with concern for other beings. And then we engage in this wonderful process of Tonglen. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Tonglen. We're running out of time like crazy, but Tonglen is a very powerful technique for working with compassion and love. And here what we're doing is we're focusing on a being or on ourselves initially, and then we can certainly enlarge it to any number of beings. And we're being aware of their suffering and wishing to remove it, and wishing even to take it on ourselves so that they don't have to experience it. Again, many teachings on this, I don't need to go into great detail. Almost every Buddhist teacher in the Tibetan Buddhism in particular teaches on it. And then we focus on the happiness of others and that they lack that, and we generate the wish to give our happiness to others. So again, this is a process of taking away suffering and giving happiness. And again, I could do a whole nother class on that, but that's going to have to suffice for today. So that's the main technique for generating these same two thoughts of great love and great compassion, which are immeasurable compassion and immeasurable love, with this advanced thought of actually committing ourselves to doing that. And then you can even generate joy as part of this upon the thought of having removed the suffering of beings and placed them in happiness. In fact, they encourage you, and I always do that, stop for a moment and rejoice that you've done this in your visualization. Of course, you haven't really done it, and so you have to go on to develop the same two thoughts that the other technique concluded with, that superior intention and then the mind of bodhicitta. And of course, when you arrive at the mind of enlightenment, the mind of bodhicitta, then you stabilize on that. I might point out real quickly that there is a way to practice the Four Immeasurables with Tonglen, where with the immeasurable equanimity, where you're thinking about beings being free from their distorted views of attachment, aversion, and so on, you take that away from them. And then with the immeasurable love, you give your happiness to them so they can have the happiness they seek. With immeasurable compassion, you take their suffering. And then with immeasurable joy, you give all your merits so that they can experience, again, the happiness of higher rebirth and liberation, enlightenment. And then I have included a little prayer that you could use at the end of the Four Immeasurables. In particular, I must achieve enlightenment quickly in order to free all the numberless kind mother sentient beings from the unimaginable oceans of samsaric suffering and causes of suffering, and lead them to peerless full enlightenment. For this purpose, I'm going to undertake the practice of whatever it is that you're going to do, Lam-rim meditation, or green Tara practice, or whatever the case might be. Whew, okay. Sorry, I end up doing this, and I end up going over anyway, but nonetheless. So again, I wish I had a little more time to talk about bodhicitta, but I'm glad we did spend the time we did on immeasurable joy, because this is, again, very important to practice as well. Any final comments or questions before we do a mini rejoicing and dedication? Yes, Mark.
It's so complicated.
It's so complicated.
For me, okay, I see a person that needs help. I try and help them. It doesn't work. And then I look at why it doesn't work. And fundamentally, it's my giant ego and their giant ego, and which points toward working for enlightenment.
Sure.
But it seems like a much simpler model than.
No, it is complex. It is complicated, Mark. I mean, I think the one thing that we have to do is not get discouraged at the fact that we can't help others to the degree that we'd like to in the moment, but it shouldn't stop us then from trying. Yeah, I mean, use some wisdom too. I remember Chogyam Trungpa coined the term idiot compassion, where we just kind of go in full steam ahead like a bull in a china shop and don't think about what really needs to be done. I think we have to avoid that if we can. Use what wisdom we do have to think about what's the best thing to do for this being. But even if their ego gets in the way of doing it and our ego gets in the way of it being successful, we still do it. Just have to find a way to get past some of that. And again, recognize, as you said, to funnel that back into, well, then that's why I need to become even more qualified, because in my current state, it's just going to mess it up, essentially. But don't stop trying. Don't stop being concerned and reaching out. That often happens. There's that story. Sorry, I'm going to end up adding more time to this. The story of Shariputra, who generated bodhicitta, but then he was out, and I don't know, kind of a weird story. He was walking along, and this sort of ogre type being appears to him and says, "Give me your arm," like he was going to eat his arm, one cannibal or something. And so Shariputra takes his, what is it? He takes his left hand, he chops off his right arm to give to this ogre. And then he goes to give it to him with his left hand. And in India, you don't give people things with your left hand. Why? Does anyone know? That's what you use to wipe your bottom after you've done your business. So that's not the hand that you offer to anything to somebody. So this ogre slaps away the arm and says, "Well, how dare you give me that with your left hand?" Shariputra apparently lost his bodhicitta. He kind of said, with beings like you in the world, I can't possibly get everyone enlightened. That's what we want to avoid. Don't get so discouraged thinking, because there's a lot of people out there who are like that, right? Who are going to slap away whatever it is that you offer, or something else is going to happen that's going to make them unresponsive or unappreciative. That isn't the goal. The goal is to try to stay in touch with your own heart and do what you can. And sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't. Anyway. All right. Let's conclude for today. I'm sure there's many more comments that people could add, but thank you so much for allowing me to go blah, blah, blah about the Four Immeasurables. I do want to point out one little thing. There's a flyer that's out on the table there. This is coming up in April. I think I've mentioned this in at least one of these classes. I've been very active with what's called Nonviolent Santa Fe, helped to kind of create that group. It's part of an overarching thing in the US of nonviolent cities. And one of the things that I'm doing with them, with some of my people I collaborate with, is a workshop called Exploring Nonviolence, Tools for Managing Conflict in Everyday Life. It's not Buddhist per se, but we're trying to do it at many different faith communities and out in the world at large. And so that's going to be happening on April 19th. And if you have any questions about that, let me know, but there's a flyer out there. There will be limited attendance because it's a workshop and it won't be online. I apologize, those of you who live out of town, who are online tonight and what have you, or those in the Gompa here who've come from out of town. It's really something that is best managed in person because it is a workshop with various exercises and what have you. But let's dedicate then. And before we dedicate, let's just take a moment to do this very brief thought of rejoicing. In rejoicing, we can do it any moment, as we were talking about earlier with Nina's question or Nina's comment, right? We can take a moment right now to rejoice in our being here. Start with yourself, that you spent this time here today, as well as the time that you've come for this course, all the things that you do that are virtuous, that are wholesome, your own practice, your own study, the ways that you are kind to others, generous, compassionate. How wonderful. And also generate joy at everyone else here today. We might not know everyone directly, who they are, what they do. But we know they're here today, engaging in these teachings, thinking about these amazing qualities, trying to be a better person. Really rejoice in others just like you who are here today. And rejoice in all of the good that there is in our world, all the good qualities, all of what arises from those good qualities, all the good karma. How wonderful. These are the things we need to focus on, stay aware of, and generate this feeling of joy in response to all of that, rather than being focused continually on all that is wrong or imperfect. And in particular, we're going to think about all the positive potential we've created, taking joy in it, and then dedicating it. So we'll put the dedication prayers on the screen. We're dedicating it with Master Shantideva's prayer from his 10th chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara, so that it has amazing benefits for all beings.
May all beings
Everywhere plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing and the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth. Those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other.
For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Gangri Rawe Korwe Shikam Dir Pandan Dewa Malu Shungwe Ne Chanre Zigwa Tenzin Gyatso Yi Sape Site Bardu Tangyur Chi.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's dedicate also for the good, or for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director, as well as for the good health and long lives of all of our other spiritual teachers. And lastly, we dedicate for the beings that we're holding in our hearts. And as we've done, just try to extend this out beyond those who are in your immediate circle, not just thinking about them, their problems, and dedicating for them to be free from those, but all the suffering there is in the world, as much as you can open your heart to. May this all be removed through the force of what we've done here today, and may all beings then also find the causes that will lead them to true happiness. Okay, thank you all so much. Appreciate it. Know that I will be coming back in April. With Geshe Tashi's absence, unfortunately, it would be wonderful if he could have been here for these next 3 months. But I do have free time in April, so I'll be here for the 4 Sundays in April. And just know that for that one, we're going to do a separate topic each Sunday, so we won't have this continuity. And if you miss one, you can just simply, that's okay, come to the next one. They're all going to be kind of, I hope, topics that are helping to address what's going on in our world and how to be more open and responsive to what's happening. So I hope that they will be a benefit in that way. But thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to teach on the Four Immeasurables. Thank you all online. Thank you, Sheila, for hosting online. Nancy here and Lou as well. Okay, bye-bye.